Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I'm joined by Nuala Walsh, the author of a fantastic new book, Tune In: How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World. Nuala is a behavioral scientist, a TEDx speaker, a non-executive director, and an award-winning former executive with 3 decades in investment management, banking, and consulting. She's the founder and CEO of MindEquity and holds appointments as president of the Harvard Club of Ireland, chair of the Innocence Project London, and founding director of the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Joining us today from Dublin, one of my favorite places on earth. So, kind people, great food, beautiful architecture, great literary history. What a gorgeous place to be from.
Well, it is, to be fair, and I need to spend more time here rather than London, where I normally am. So it's good to be here.
Beautiful. Great to see you. So whenever I have an author on, Nuala, we've just spent about 20 minutes commiserating about the joys and pains of having written a book. Writing a book is a long, thankless process. It pays poorly. The only reason to do it is because you have something you just have to say. Well, why did you take on this insane project? And what was the thing that you just had to put out in the universe?
Well, you are not wrong, Dan. It is a long process and it's partly thankless. It doesn't pay at all, not poorly, just at all. So you're right. You must actually believe in your message to some extent. And I do, fortunately. So I guess my overall message is around that sort of, despite what everybody thinks and popular opinion, the most underestimated risk isn't what we think of economic, technology or climate, it's human decision risk. And you will get that from your old word. But I guess my point is that it's triggered by our tendency to tune out and tune out the voices that really matter when they matter. And most people don't think of this as a risk. But the problem is that it's rising in a noisy world. There are so many unheard voices, whether it's your client, a voter, employee, or even your loved one. And the real problem is that it's getting worse, especially in a high stakes situation, under pressure, or conflict, or uncertainty. So, in essence, we tune out when we should be tuning in, and it's a problem because it's not taught in classrooms, it's not taught in boardrooms. Yet decision-making excellence is assumed, it's expected, and it's punished when you get it wrong. So for me, the evidence is there. Tuning out explains why so many people get duped, why regulators miss everything from a Ponzi scheme, intelligence agencies miss those terrorist warnings, and in the corporate world, why boards continue to fail, mergers destroy value, and so many startups implode. So of course, it can't be tuned in all the time, but when we tune out, it is really when the real problem starts. So what I was trying to do, to your point, what I wanted to do was really set people up for success. And I do that by trying to give them a really simple technique to optimize their judgments. And rather than guessing, jumping to conclusions, taking things at face value, I've illustrated how tuning out is a source of informational liability, to use the jargon, whereas tuning in is, of course, a source of opportunity or an asset. And you very kindly read the book, so you will know that for the first time I've tried to focus on deaf spots. So a lot, we talk about blind spots a lot, we all know about that, but very few people actually write about deaf spots and being tuned out and deaf ear syndrome. And that is a problem because it's just something that people don't talk about. But where you have a problem, you also have an opportunity. And it is much easier to get things right and avoid regret than people think. And I think if you're a power holder, you have an absolute obligation to do so. So I'm hoping it's going to change how people think about their decisions. And so far, it's been very well received by a range of different people.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love this idea of deaf spots. All this talk about blind spots, we've never until you talked about deaf spots. The other thing that I think about when I look back on my own life and, knock on wood, I'm about halfway through. When I look back on my own life, like the quality of your decisions is the number one thing that predicts the quality of your life. I mean, there's nothing more important. And it's not a one for one. You can make a good decision and have a bad result, as we'll talk about today. But the quality of your decisions so directly impacts the quality of your life, relationally, financially, on and on. And yet it's not taught anywhere. And I know Annie Duke has a nonprofit that's doing some work to teach decision-making in schools. You're obviously here doing your part. But I think it's such an important thing to remember that the quality of your decisions impacts the quality of your life. And we just don't get any formal training in this. And then lastly, more than half the world is voting this year, right? More than half the world is in an election year. And it's this sort of like everything just lined up where, many of the world's powers will be going to the polls this year. And it's fascinating to think about how we make deeply consequential decisions about who will lead us. So let's talk about this noisy world, Nuala. You talk about 4 factors. And one of the things that has sort of been a hallmark of my work is taking things that are enormously complex and trying to distill it down into its essence to codify it a bit. And I think you've done that very nicely here. You talk about 4 factors that amplify the risk of noise, obscuring our ability to arrive at the truth. Spend a minute walking us through those 4 and why they're important, if you would.
Yeah, and it starts with exactly what you said, which is our decision-making doesn't exist in a vacuum. And that's why I sort of have gone out of my way to introduce the book by talking about why the most important determinant is the context in which we decide. And the context, whether it's your internal mindset or the external environment. And I start with the external environment. And the external environment is exactly what you say, is this noisy world, because that dictates our ability. So the odds are stacked against us because of these 4 factors. And now there might be more, but I think the 4 are pretty predominant. And if you can manage it to any one of them, you increase your probability of a better decision. So the first one is it's a visual world. Secondly, it's a speedy, fast-paced world. Thirdly, it's a polarized world. And fourthly, it's a data-driven world. So taking speed, it's self-evident. We know that a fast-paced, frantic lifestyle accelerates our decision speed and our tendency to be more short-term. So what I think is that today's fast-paced ecosystem is really just amplifying the probability of getting it wrong. And it's really ironic, Dan. I mean, in the professional world, we pay professionals an awful lot of money, too much money in many industries, to make considered decisions for us. But yet we applaud a prompt reply, and a rapid solution and a quick win. But we're paying them for these slow or deliberate decisions, which we don't always get. So for me, that's even just the first pace. I mean, you could talk about the fast-paced world. We're rushing. We don't have time to slow down. It's a speedy decision context. We live in the fast lane. And even our organization systems and structures contribute to that. So the speedy world, I think we can all get. The second one we can probably get pretty quickly to, which is it's a data-driven world. And a data-driven world distracts and overwhelms the mind. So you've got the examples where the FBI have missed, signals, corporate leaders miss signals, parents miss signals, with children, etc. And we can blame this on excessive data as well. So being overloaded is the new normal. And that's why this is getting worse. When you're overloaded, when it's noisy, you don't hear. You can't hear. So even with the best will in the world, your capacity is constrained. 25%, I think, is the best we can hope for, even when we are consciously trying to listen to different people. So I think it was Microsoft who found that 60% of people don't have enough time employees don't have enough uninterrupted time and time to do their job. So that's a real problem if you think, over 2/3 of people don't have enough time to do their job. So how can we expect them to make really great decisions as well? So, Nate Silver, I think, has it right in we need to be able to distinguish the signal from the noise. And to do that, you need to have enough time. I don't know if you saw this, but Sam Bankman-Fried, just before he was arrested and he was, spouting lyrically for the journalists, says something like, I didn't have enough brain cycles left to understand everything that was going on. He was so overloaded. Yeah. That doesn't explain his behavior, but it does contribute to it. And then the third one, which is a theme that I really do like, which is that it's a visual world. I think you've had on previous podcasts talking about, how visually stimulated we are and how we judge everything by what we see, which we know, first impressions, the X factor, etc. But because we do this, we judge the guilty based on demeanour, for example. So if you're in a court of law as a juror, your job is to weigh the evidence, not to decide by the look of, Freddie in the box whether he's guilty or not. But the problem is that's exactly what people do. And in the book, there's a terrific study that shows that when people have all of this, jurors have all of this information, they only change their mind a quarter of the time. So they decide, they rush to judgment based on their first impressions. And we know that that's a problem. And in an Instagram world, that's pretty strong. And because you do that, we don't think. We don't tune in because we've already decided based on the visual factor, for neurological reasons, physical reasons, etc. And the last one is it's a binary world. It's polarized. And we know this. We think in polarized ways. Marketeers segment their customers logically, but your colleague is either sporty or academic. You're an introvert or an extrovert. You've high or low potential. You're rarely nuanced, even though we know reality is nuanced. So if you combine those four factors, they make it more difficult to make better decisions because the world is even noisier, and that's not even thinking about what's in your mind, Tanya. So from an external point of view, that's what's going on. Add into that all of these issues from an internal perspective, but these external factors that are rising diminish the time, attention, and patience available to reinterpret any sort of critical information or conversations that people have. And there are other stats that show that people think in studies that 47% of people think deep thinking is a thing of the past, which is a real worry. And as a result, we mishear what people say or don't say. You only have to think of any of the aircraft, some of the terrorists, not the terrorists, the Tenerife crash was purely based on mishearing, rushing to judgment. And I think 335 people died in that particular tragedy. So this acceleration of a rush to judgment and human error is completely a product of this crazy, noisy world that we live in. And it is actually only getting worse. I can't see it all slowing down or having less data or being less polarized anytime soon.
No, I'm with you. So I'll use two examples here. I mean, this is a tough question, to be fair, but you mentioned Microsoft. So a week or two ago, I got some sort of notification from Microsoft. We use it at work for our correspondence and email and calendaring and things like that. And they were giving me a report on my quote unquote productivity. And the measure of that productivity was how many emails I had sent that week. And it was the most wrong-headed, for me, a knowledge worker, it's almost the inverse. Like if I'm sending a lot of emails, something is wrong. Because what I should be doing is building content, building tools, building new technology for my company. Like if I've sent a bunch of emails that week, that doesn't mean I'm productive. It's the opposite of that. It means I've been mired in unproductive work. And yet there's sort of this perverse incentive to do this low quality frenetic work, right? So hold that, right? So sometimes the incentives are bad, right? We have incentives to make sort of harried, low quality decisions or do low quality work. And then the second thing is something like the visual piece you talked about. We're just wired for that. I mean, we know about the halo effect. When someone's good looking or well dressed or, well put together, we know reliably there's a host of positive assumptions we're going to make about their intellect and their work ethic and a host of other things. There's reasons why that's the case, but that's sort of an evolutionary deep cut thing. So when our rewards are misaligned, when evolution has misaligned us, what do we do when the forces working against us are so so well resourced, I guess.
Well, it's a great point. And going back to your point about Microsoft, you're not wrong. The measures with which we're judged, and it reminded me very clearly of when I used to work in investment management. Our sales teams used to be rewarded by, and this is 1970s stuff, but not so long ago, they were rewarded by the number of calls they made to clients. Like, what is that about? So again, it was about volume, etc.
Right.
But your point about this, the evolutionary point, it is difficult, but it's not impossible. I really do think that where there's a will, there's a way. Once you are conscious of these, and it's not only awareness, because we know about the behavior attention, but at least if you are aware of some of these factors, you have a better chance of avoiding error rather than if you sit in a vacuum. But the problem is, going back to this point about people refuse to accept that there is any kind of that they are biased, and there are plenty of studies that show that people just deny it altogether, even though the evidence exists and it's there. So it's almost like a paradox of bias that 90% of us don't think we're biased, and particularly at the top, because you've been so successful getting from A to B. Well, I have to be smart and I have to be right and I have to be successful. And it is on that rock that people perish, because you might have been successful, but you also might have had an easier journey because you weren't always successful. And you also can climb, because the only way from the top is, of course, down. And I think that's played out in the media and in many companies who've just got it wrong. Unfortunately, have just got it wrong.
Yeah, it's my hope that lots of people will read your book, because we have to make sure we're measuring and incentivizing the right things, right? I think, you laid it out very, very nicely. I'm sure a lot of people were nodding their heads as you describe, this visual world, this fast-paced world. And yet we know this, and I think oftentimes we still reward the wrong things. We reward speed over depth. We reward bombast over nuance. I mean, that's a well-known tendency in political spheres, right? In this election year, people want sort of, bumper sticker slogans that are emotionally exciting over deep, well thought out policy. And as long as we are paying these people, as long as we're voting for these people, as long as we're promoting these people, we're going to get what we've always gotten. So I hope lots of people will read the book and start to measure their lives and their productivity in new ways. Let's talk about a perimeters trap and how multiple layers of bias can combine and sort of conspire to make us suboptimal decision makers.
Yeah, well, what I did was I identified 10 situations or conditions, if you like, that basically make us more prone to make it to error. And there are 10, and they form the word. The first letter features in mnemonic form the word perimeters. So I'll just tell you very briefly the 10, because I do think it makes life easy if we can even remember these. So the first one is power. And by power, I mean when we disproportionately elevate the voice of an idol or an expert or a senior. So once you and sublimate your own voice. So it's not having power or being in power. It's the mistakes you make when you're craving power or about to lose power. So it's a power-related misjudgment trap. The next one is an ego-related judgment trap. So again, it could be yours, it could be in a group, and obviously we all know what ego is. So you're sublimating your own voice over everybody else's all the time, and then it could be high or low ego. So the higher your ego, the more prone you are to these, and you will see they're very obvious ones. They're very obvious situations, but each of these have a blend of 5 or 6 biases that can be triggered. So then you've got risk, which you're probably comfortable with, and that's like, when you are either excessively sensation-seeking or you're risk-averse. Identity, which is I, which is when you are craving recognition. So this is all about image and image management and your own curated self-image. Then you've got memory, which is when we overly trust our ability to accurately recall, and we know that's a problem because of false memories. Ethics, how often do you listen to the voice of temptation over doing the right thing? T, I'm testing my own memory now, T. T is time. So when we overweight the past, the present, or the future, we're too short term, too long term, all of these conditions, and as I'm going through this, Anya, you could probably think, well, I can think of 3 or 4 biases that would be categorized in this way. E is emotion, pretty obvious. Relationships, that's the crowd relationships, when you pay too much attention to the voice of the crowd. And then stories are when you readily accept any social, political, or organizational narrative. So all of those spell perimeters, and they are all interrelated but very different. So risk, for example, is a combination of ego, I'm a risk taker, identity, I'm a risk taker, time, obviously, and emotion, fear or not. Memory is about time and stories. So there's a force multiplier effect in all of these. Mm-hmm. So the trick is to, even in your head when you're thinking about a decision or a feeling, am I suffering from, am I liable to PERIMATERS? And they're very easy to remember. And so I've started to try and do that if you break down your decisions, you then go to the book and see, well, here are the 3 or 4 I'm feeling that, maybe I'm afraid of losing power or something. And then you read ego, well, it's probably just a bit of ego. I should just manage that, but knowing it is everything, Daniel. So we diagnose before we prescribe in life. And so knowing that, I think, is huge. And I think it's a huge opportunity to stand out rather than lose out, to gain a knowledge that other people don't have. Because remember, 90% of people are so arrogant half the time that they think they know everything anyway, and they don't bother to analyze other people's behaviors because they're so self-oriented. But if you do this, and if you focus on other people more and understanding your colleagues, your bosses, the regulators, your competitors, you will gain a massive advantage. And that's why it's if you don't, you're liable for the traps. But if you do, you're liable to gain a huge advantage. So that's what I call. So each one of those is what I call a perimeter's misjudgment trap. But there is a huge amount of nuance. It's very easy to say, well, ego's ego. We know that, but it's the overconfidence. It's the illusion of invulnerability, that illusion of control, the spotlight effect, the illusion that everything you have of validity. So all of these really important biases combine. And I don't think that's been done before. We've all read all of the summations of the different biases. I do think this is the most comprehensive. I've seen 25 codified before. I don't think I've seen 75 codified in this way, where it's situational based, as in a risk-seeking situation or a low-risk situation. So for me, I feel that's a little bit different.
Yeah, no, it's a great mnemonic. We know there's something called the rhyme is reason effect. One of the most famous examples of the rhyme is reason effect passed away this week. O.J. Simpson, if you remember from the O.J. Simpson trial, what is it? If the gloves don't,
if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, and it's the book.
Yeah. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit, right? And so you've actually used that here in your own mnemonic, in your own sort of acrostic here to spell out something that's very memorable and is a great shorthand for people. We should create a graphic of perimeters, hang it in every office in America.
I have one done. I'm going to send one out. I have one done.
Okay, let's sell some perimeters graphics. I think this should go in every office in America. And when we're looking at making a big decision, which of these are at play, and how I like the idea. Again, I find that quite novel. The idea of them as a force multiplier, right? When there's multiple of these at play, and they sort of playing off of each other. Let's drill. We don't have time for all 10. Let's drill down on a couple of them. Some of them I've written about at length, so I'll go into less detail there. The P, though, I have not done much with. I found that quite novel, right? The power piece in our decision-making efforts. Talk to us about the role of power and how that can confound our best efforts.
Yeah, power it was a hard one to write in many respects because so much has been written about power. And so I didn't want to sort of reinvent the wheel. I could have written the whole book on power, to be quite honest, Daniel, and maybe I'll do another book purely on power. But it's not about holding power. It's about when it's the effect it has on you when you could be early in your career and you're desperate, craving, which I might have been in my day once upon a time. We're all craving the power, the recognition, the status, the title. And people do. I know not everyone does, but a lot of people do. What decisions are you making? What judgments are you making? What sacrifices are you making when you're in that zone? Maybe you're not making the best decisions for yourself or your family or your welfare or your financial future. So, and then you're in a position of power. So you do think Donald Trump, he was afraid of losing power. What did he do? Well, we all know what he did. So when you are threatened with the loss of power, what decisions do you make? And then I deliberately added in a piece of, when you have lost power, what can you do to regain it? So this is really important. And I do feel that in an organization, we have a tendency to give away our own power. When you crave the feedback of someone else, whether it's a Twitter person, or feedback on your book or your latest article or your presentation or your pitch, you are sublimating yourself and your happiness to someone's going, great job, or I didn't really like that, or that wasn't for me. As soon as you give away your power, you actually are you are more vulnerable to making, worse decisions for you. You don't feel good for a start. So for me, that is an issue. And what I brought into this chapter especially is goal hunting. Now, we all know it's important to have a goal. We know. But when you are excessively goal hunting as an athlete or as a CEO, someone looking for business, and you can pick any example of a scandal where this is goal hunting gone wrong, power hunting gone wrong. I used the example of Purdue Pharmaceutical because it pertains to the opioid crisis. And the reason I like that example is because it's not just about Purdue looking for, to sell their OxyContin as a 1% addiction risk rather than the real addiction risk that it did hold. But there were so many people complicit in that story. So, the salespeople were given uncapped bonuses, but distributors, pharmacy chains, physicians were all complicit. And what's worse is, I don't know if you remember this, but McKinsey certainly paid a hefty fine for their involvement, because what they were doing was, they were advising Purdue at the same time that they were advising the FDA. And that's a complete conflict of interest. Obviously, goal hunting, seeking more positions of power. And power is you define it. So power might be, being number one for some person, or being, number one in Wimbledon for somebody else. It might be being a great parent, or, running the tennis club. I don't know. But whatever you define as power is where you need to think, where am I at risk now? I want this so badly. What decisions am I going to make? Who's going to pay the price for this? So the more you win, of course, the more you fear losing. So the power trap, it's a power-related trap but it's on the journey of power. And I think it's a phenomenal topic that, it doesn't do justice to even just have it at one chapter.
So have you read Will Storr's book, what's it called? The Status Game?
No.
So it's a fantastic read. I think it's called The Status Game, but Will Storr is the author. It's something like that if it's not that. But it's sort of his theory of everything, which is, an inherently difficult and fraught thing to come up with a theory of everything. But he makes a pretty strong case for status being sort of the bottommost turtle of human behavior, and sort of the thing that we're all after, which is just, power by a different name. So Nuala, I guess my question is, like, I hear you describing this, and I can see how, the absence of power could make us hungry for power and distort our thinking. I can see how the presence of power and the desire to retain that power could distort our thinking. But insofar as the desire for status and power are sort of baked in the cake, what is the correct stance to take with respect to power when we're making decisions, I guess?
I don't think it's what's the correct stance. It's just being aware of how this is affecting you. So sure. If you know that you really want a promotion, you really want the promotion, what decisions are you making? Are you stabbing your colleague in the back? Are you cheating? When you're making a decision, well, will I cheat or not? Or, will I press this horrible email? Well, what will I do? What decisions are you making in order to achieve that goal, or to gain that status, or to gain that right? So this is about just rechecking yourself when you're trying to make a decision. So your decision could be, will I speak up, or will I not? So there's power in that, because you might be speaking up against people who have power. So asking yourself these questions: how much am I at risk for doing this? Why am I doing this? and what is really driving my behavior. And is it power relation? It's okay. It might be power relation. It might be okay, of course, because a lot of people, we all want power in some shape or form. But when you're doing something that goes against your best interest and you're tuning out the voice of conscience or the voice of common sense, well, then it doesn't make sense, does it? It's not the smart thing to do. You're not making the best decisions. So it's which voices are, if you're only listening to your boss because he's the boss, and you know the Ohio experiment, of course, which shows that people just obey authority. The nurses just did whatever the doctor said because they were in positions of power. Or you have the classic Stanford prison experiment, or you have Sally Milgram's experiment. So you have all of these examples of just compliance, because someone is the boss. And so what I'm trying to do in this chapter as well is, why are you making these decisions? Is it just because I'm afraid of the boss? I mean, I did an example in my own house the other day. I tried to look after my mother, who's 85, and the doctor said, do X. And I said, well, why are we doing X? And my sisters were going, because the doctor said to do X. Something. No, there are so many examples that we need to challenge the doctor or the lawyer or the professional or the therapist at times as appropriate, rather than just accepting the word of these people. Because they might be right, but they might be wrong. And so even when people do have power, there is something about not just accepting it, because otherwise then you are vulnerable to, the authority bias, for example, or the conformity bias. So there are so many in here. So we've talked about the narrow focus, authority bias and conformity bias, I think, are really important in here as well.
Yeah. So the appropriate stance is just an awareness that it exists, that it's formative in the decision, one way or another, and just be thoughtful about how power is playing out, because it's always there, right? Power is always going to be present, right? We're going to skip E, right? We're going to head off to risk. You write, motivation to minimize loss is rooted in rational self-interest, yet it severs useful decision options. So talked a lot on this show about our distaste for uncertainty, our distaste for risk, different things, but related. How can our distaste for risk lead us to prematurely cut off our options or cut us off from choice? Talk to us about the risk piece of this whole thing.
Yeah, again, it narrows our thinking. And that's why the word perimeters was carefully used. It narrows our thinking. Our perimeters shrink because we're so obsessed. We don't like the unknown. We prefer certainty to ambiguity and chaos. And we see this in the markets. You see it everywhere. So this loss aversion that we have, this desire for certainty, stops us broadening our horizons. It's why companies hire the same kind of people or retain the same suppliers. You don't see churn in suppliers in many companies. Or, you might have a domestic in financial services, in investments, you might have companies that only focus on domestic, stocks, for example. Now that might be strategic. I get sometimes that's just strategic, but sometimes it isn't strategic. Sometimes it's like ex post facto rationalization. No, I'm going to be strategic and only focus on Chinese stocks, because but they're not thinking beyond that, because they've a comfort and there's a familiarity and a certainty there. So this certainty obsession is a decision risk in itself. It narrows thinking, and I think it also narrows organizations from, that they can be deaf to ideas that are perceived as unfamiliar, uncertain, far-fetched. And there are thousands of examples of companies that have just dismissed, modern technology. I think it goes right back to even, the telephone patents where, Alexander Graham Bell couldn't sell his telephone to anyone because they didn't think it was going to work. The iPhone, you've got all of these examples, again, all the cynics. So for me, it's because we hear the voice of familiarity and we reduce our risk disproportionately when we should actually be broadening our horizons.
Yeah. No, I love it. So we're going to skip I as well. We'll head off to memory. So I've just finished Paul Bloom's book, Psych, and it is a really fantastic primer on sort of everything under the sun we know about psychology. It's a great sort of survey course in a book for those who are listening and are always looking for a good book read in addition to Nuala's, right? And one of the things that I find that really blows people's minds pretty consistently is the research on memory. When the average person thinks about memory, I think that their conception of how memory works is your mind is a filing cabinet. Things that happen to you in the physical world, you objectively file them in your memory, and then you retrieve them when you think about them, and you put them back just as you found them. And what Bloom's synopsis of all the work on memory does is really explode this and talk about how basically every time we touch a memory, we shape it and change it. And there's all these biases with respect to memory and memory retrieval that you talk about quite beautifully in the book. You talk about 4 ways in which memory is retrieved: repetition, salience, sequence, and suggestion, and sort of what this does to the memory and how it impacts our decision making. Can you talk about how memory sort of differs from this sort of filing cabinet ideal that I think a lot of people have?
Yeah, and Dan, memory was one of the hardest, I think, chapters to write, because we all value our memories and we don't like to think that we're wrong. And we like to think that, well, in a world of uncertainty, we at least want to rely on our memory. It's sort of one of those, things that at least we can rely on. But as you say, what we hear is what we remember. But if we mishear, we're likely to misremember. And it's a fantastic topic because, breaking news is eventually becomes a false memory. So it's an underestimated, what I call a judgment killer. And I think we said earlier on, awareness is half the battle, but it's not a guarantee. But it does make you less susceptible and immune. But the ones that I talk about here is, I guess, things like the misremembering self. So you're just back from your holiday and you know about the misremembering self. So you're on your holiday and we say, so Dan, how was your holiday? And you say, well, Nuala was 7 out of 10 for this holiday. And every day I ask you, some days get a 6, some days get an 8. And then you come home and I say, so Dan, how was your holiday? And suddenly you're giving it 9 out of 10. Now, if you were on the 2s and 3s, you'd be giving it 0. So we have this misremembering self, and we exaggerate disproportionately the memories that we have. So you've got that. That is a problem when in a court of law, I think as you mentioned earlier on, or when you've got senior people in business. So the good news, and then you've got the power of suggestion, which is again, fabulous for a marketeer. And the power of suggestion is one of those words you talked about. So the power of suggestion is brilliant if you're an advertising person. It's a terrible thing if you're trying to convict someone in a court. It's a terrible thing if you're trying to scam somebody. So it has been used for nefarious ways just as much as it's been used for very positive ways. So repetition, you said it earlier on that rhyme is reason, news you can use. So it's fantastic and it works, but it's really dangerous because you're creating a false memory. Because it sounds good and it sounds plausible and palatable, the believability factor increases and the false memory forms. And it's very, very difficult to shift the false memory if indeed you ever do. So again, salience, when you have salience, you've got the availability bias. And again, even in investments, I think Joel Press from INSEAD has done a study a few years ago about, he tested trader susceptibility to news flow when they were choosing stocks. And so his question was, would trading volumes shift on a day that the newspapers went on strike? So it turns out that on those strike days, there was no news, no availability, and trading dropped 12%, suggesting that professionals in a noisy world rely on what's easily available rather than what's accurate or what might be a better stock. So this whole world of memory, I think it's a phenomenal area to think about. But it's just one of those that we really need to be conscious of. And once you know about the peak end rule or any of these biases, you really will you really will look at things and evaluate your experiences differently. So I think it's really powerful, and it's probably one that you might need to read twice, just because it's so good and you want to remember all of those the facts in there. And there's some terrible cases, by the way. I put in some shocking cases in there. The therapists planted memories, desperate stuff.
Yeah, is this what got you involved in the Innocence Project?
Well, Yes and no. I did forensic psychology after I left college many years ago, and I've always had an interest. And in fact, you mentioned O.J. Simpson trial. I was one of those people who watched every hour. I must have been really young, and it must have been during the school holidays, because I watched every single minute of that trial. And as you know how long ago that was. So so it sort of started around there. I sort of felt, Dan, that I understood the human behavior, and I really wanted to understand the criminal mind. And that's why in the book is a reflection of my life. There are a lot of stories, whether it's Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, some of the people, the victims of the Innocence Project are certainly in there. Some people I've met, some people from the British Post Office scandal who I met only recently. Their stories are in there too, because it's this rush to judgment and that's why I liked to use the analogy of you are like the 12th juror. Your decisions as a decision maker in business or in medicine or whatever profession you're in really matter, and you are like the 12th juror, because your decision impacts other people way more than you ever think.
So you mentioned the peak in rule. I don't know that everyone will be familiar with that, and I think that everyone should learn about research that was done on colonoscopies. So talk just briefly about the peak in rule, what it is, and how it applies to this world.
Well, I'll give you the example that I guess struck a chord with me. The example of the peak end rule is that you only remember the peak or the end of your experience. So you might be married to someone for 20 years, and you might have and that might be, a pretty good relationship. And then you get divorced, and it's an ugly, nasty, bitter divorce. You suddenly have what's called duration neglect. You forget the 19 years of happiness. Well, relatively, you probably weren't happy for all 19. Let's call it 18, because you are getting divorced. So let's just say 18 good-ish years. And because the end is so brutal, so salient in your memory, the peak end rule says this is the end. So it's either the peak or the end. So I'm choosing the end in this example. So because the end was so brutal, you discount the term, and your final abiding memory in life is of a terrible marriage, which is actually incorrect, because it was okay for, call it 17, 18 years. And that's the peak end rule. So I learned that peak end rule when I did the master's in behavioural science. I had left my employment. Now, I wasn't forcing, but I applied it on a slightly lesser level. So if you have 10 years in a company and your exit isn't a pleasant exit, or you get fired or something, well, you're not going to leave with a smile. Are you suddenly going to think, gosh, I really don't like that company, or that was a really unpleasant experience, rather than looking at it proportionately in the right way? So that's what it is, and it's a phenomenal piece. And I really do think that is the other example that people love to give. If you go for a meal and you have a fight on the way home with your partner, suddenly the meal is ruined, or the weekend away is ruined. So it doesn't have to be 20 years. It can be out for an hour or out for 2 hours for a meal. But it is one to remember, because it does affect your memory, and it does affect your future decisions.
Yeah, these types of heuristics, right? I mean, it applies to all sorts of experience. Like I said, some of the original research was done around pain and colonoscopies, right? The divorce example is brilliant. I even encourage the advisors that I work with to think about it in terms of how you set up a client meeting, right? Like, if you want your approach to be memorable, understand that people are going to have a better than average memory for the sort of most salient, most emotional, most memorable peak of a 1 hour client meeting. And they're going to have an elevated memory for how you end. So like make sure there is some point in there that is, dramatic, memorable, exciting, positive, and make sure that you send them away floating. Make sure that you send them away on a good note, because we don't remember that whole hour we spend with our advisor equally. We don't remember that 20-year marriage equally. So understanding that about human nature, you can sort of plan for it. Okay, let's talk about emotion, right? This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's the whole reason I wrote The Behavioral Investor, is because I got in a fight. Fight is too strong a word. I had a public disagreement with someone with whom I was on a panel. and over the role of emotion in decision making and in the world of finance, right? There are times that we hear, with respect especially to finance, that we should be emotionless, right? That we should be sort of a calculator, be robotic. But we also know from the work of Damasio and others that that's not really possible, right? That sort of every decision we make, most of all with money in particular, has some sort of emotional substrate. We know that emotion has, that emotion is in very real respect a form of information. So help us figure this out. When is emotion positive? When can emotion be additive to a decision-making process? And when is emotion a distraction that should be avoided?
Yeah, and again, I'd say, Dan, there's no simple answer to this for a couple of reasons. One, that there are 27 different emotions. So you could say, well, which one are we talking about?
Right.
So it's not that easy. And you're absolutely right. You've got the good emotions and you've got the bad emotions. So every angry moment means you've got fewer productive moments, etc. So, on the positive side, it can be used phenomenally well. And I like your example from the using it from a marketing perspective, the peak end rule, for example. So you are creating an emotion, you are creating a positive emotional attachment to whatever experience that is. But for example, people use it in fundraising. So I remember, Boomtown Rat singer, who you may remember, political activist Bob Geldof. He was inspired, to form Band-Aid many, many years ago because he was hoping to solve world poverty, or certainly African poverty at the time. So he galvanized an awful lot of people, if you remember, from, I think it was over 100 countries, to support famine relief. So that's an example. And I think Lady Gaga did it recently, during COVID. So she did something similar. And ironically, they raised roughly around the same amount, saving, millions of lives through this. So it can be used for positive, pro-social reasons like charities. But I think also it can be used in sports. I mean, I sit on a number of different boards. And one of my favorite examples from sports is the 1988 Winter Olympics. And I don't know if you remember, the first British downhill skier to compete was an underperformer. And I think it was nicknamed Eddie the Eagle. He had broken more bones than records. I mean, basically had no talent. But he captured the crowd. And the crowd lifted him, roared him to the finish. So it was almost as if he came last in both, but it was like media was celebrating like he'd won gold. So this motivational factor, the crowd pulling together, using emotion to spur people on, it's used everywhere. So I think it's kind of obvious in many ways that it can be used for positive effects, but then obviously it should be avoided when it causes harm. And how many examples of that do we want? Envy, professional envy, really nasty and insidious. Greed, revenge, jealousy. For greed, I think of the rogue traders. For rage, I sort of think of, the sport. I don't know what trainers you were, but if you were, Adidas or Adidas, however people want to pronounce it, versus Puma, and you have that story of the two German brothers, and had this feud for years. So that's rage, that's vanity, that's not reappraised for many years. People didn't even know what that was about, for example. So there are many different ways that emotion can be used positively and negatively. And I think, again, like the force multiplier effect, knowing that it's not that simplistic and that it is a combination of emotions, that they change radically. But I think knowing which emotions help you on your way and which emotions get in your way is probably a very useful barometer.
I think the thread that's emerging for me here too is awareness. One of the things that I feel very strongly about with my own children is teaching them to be informed consumers of media. And we live in one of a handful of important swing states. We live in Georgia, which is about 50-50 Democrat and Republican. And it's a very, it's a big-ish state. It's important in the national election. And so as a result, there's a big political ad spend here. And so anytime I'm watching TV with my kids, there's bound to be political ads. And I will pause it and say, okay, this image is black and white. Like, what's the music Like, what's the music made to make you feel? You know, what's the black and white imagery as opposed to color imagery made to feel? What's the font made, it's supposed to make you feel? And now my kids will joke about it. And, too radical for Georgia. These ads that are not playing on the better angels of your nature, right? That are not playing on your intellect, but are playing on your emotion. And just understanding that for what it is, you can receive it in a new way. I think when you know how central power, emotion, memory, all these things are, you don't just take them at face value. You become an informed consumer of financial news, of political news. And then I think you're able to make a better decision, because emotion is so fundamental, right? I mean, it was our original risk tolerance questionnaire that we all sort of have inside of us. We're running around. It's not going anywhere. But you have to understand that people know that, right? Politicians, advertisers, talking heads know that about us, and they'll exploit it if you let them, and you can't take it at face value.
Yeah, I like that phrase. You're right. Just being a more informed consumer of the information that you're getting. I think it is a nice way to put that.
So, this is we got two more questions. This one's a little bit of a personal question. The book is very personal, and one of the things that I value most in people is being widely read and just sort of having some sort of interest and some proficiency in a potpourri of topics. And you certainly tick that box. You got everything from killer clowns to, everything in between in here. How are you changed as a result of having written this? How do you manage your money differently? How do you think about, being a consumer of ads or a consumer? Like, how are you changed as a result of having done the extensive research it took to write this book?
I think in a couple of ways, to be honest. I haven't changed my money. My approach to investing, I'm probably still the same. I am more aware of every one of these biases. Some of them I knew, most of them I knew. The stories, I now remember them all. I actually want to remember all of the facts and all of the stuff in the book. I mean, we all have, I can't remember all of them, but as soon as I have a trigger word, I remember it. I want to remember it because I think it's really powerful, all of them, on all of the facts. What I do differently is I apply them. I think I said earlier on, I use them in the mnemonic, the perimeters. I now do go through different situations. So, for example, I might say, well, how successful is this book going to be? So when I first started, one of my sisters said, why are you doing it? And, what do you hope to get out of it? At the time, I genuinely said, well, I want to share this good information and I just want it out there and I don't care about sales. Now, I still don't care about sales, if you know what I mean, in terms of the numbers. That's not my driver. My driver is that it gets into more hands, exactly as we were saying earlier, that more people are aware of these potential issues and of this opportunity to change and get it right. That's actually probably what I care about most. However, if I was to go down the route of if sales was the main driver, for example, I would be thinking, well, is that about power? Is that ego? Is that identity? What matters most? But when you go back to, so going through a process of analysing whatever matters and why, I think is really important. I also, as a hobby, now try to, and I have done this since, for example, the O.J. Simpson case you talked about. I've written a new article on that because I was fascinated about it. I could have applied all the perimeters, but I wouldn't have room in this particular article. But I now analyse some of that using the perimeters traps, and I'm able to pull out the names of these things like the illusion of invulnerability much more top of mind than I would have had before I started the research, because now it's ingrained. P for perimeters, I could nearly list off the five biases that and I do that check in my head. So I use this much more extensively. When I'm listening to other people's problems, I'm actually able to come out with them a lot quicker than I might have before. So for me, it's been an education in itself. And pulling together the perimeters was quite hard. And coming up with the trilogy of error was hard. And pulling together the 18 sonic strategies was also quite difficult. But now I feel I'm in a much better place to share that, and to share it. It will become more and more part of me the more I talk about it, and the more you learn. When you talked earlier about learning, the more we learn, and it becomes internalized. So no direct changes, nothing that I'm doing differently, but I'm probably thinking and evaluating things a little bit differently.
The reason I love behavioral science, it's not just a job, it's a way of life. You talked about somebody asks you what I think for many people would be a relatively simple question, like, what do you want from the book? Well, yeah, just sell a bunch. I mean, that's one. I know that's not your answer, but that would be a respectable enough answer and a logical enough answer. But then, why? Is that meeting an emotional need? Is that a power need? Right? Is there some sort of legacy piece involved? I think when you start to learn these things, you get better at examining your own intentions, you become more honest about your own motivations, and you become more adept at seeing those things in other people. To close us out here, for those who have listened to this or seen this, and are like, look, there's so much great information here. The Perimeters is awesome. But what's just one or two practical things I can do today, right? As I move through the next week, what one or two practical things I can do today to become a better decision maker? What would you tell that person?
Yeah, I'll go with the first one just to make it easy, because there are easy examples there. I think the idea of decision friction is really easy. So friction in the real world is negative. On the online world, we don't want anything friction. We want a seamless experience. But I suggest if you create decision friction in your mind, you slow down, you pause, you interrupt yourself, you interpret. This isn't about listening, this book. It's about interpreting what other people say and tuning into different reasons. So really the whole thing is decision friction. If you remember decision friction, which is quite intentional, I think that's a really easy thing that people can do. And I guess the other thing is to create decision rules. A decision rule for yourself that says, well, I'm not going to make this decision. And this kind of counters some of the emotionality. And if you make that a habit, so I'm always going to ask 2 questions before I decide. If you hear someone gives you information, ask yourself, what do they know that I don't? Or will I regret following this piece of advice or not? So whenever you decide your own rule, but creating a decision rule stops you falling. Now, I would, of course, suggest that your decision rule is that you always consult my perimeters checklist, because that's what it is. And again, it's available to people, a checklist, so that people can see and just remind themselves, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And how easy is that? I mean, it's a pause. It's like a mental speed bump for the mind. You just stop, you pause, and it gives you a reason to pause. And you can pause and get it wrong, but at least you've paused and tried. And I do say that the book is a guarantee, not of no mistakes, but certainly of fewer mistakes if you at least invest some time in this area.
Yeah. Well, once again, the book is Tune In: How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World. It is a very noisy world. It's chaotic, it's fast-paced, it's visual. Thank you for being our guide to this mess. Nuala, you're wonderful. Thank you so much. If people want to learn more about you and your work, where can they find you?
They can go to my website, www.nualagwalsh.com, or as always, on LinkedIn.
Yes, and that's Nuala, because I don't know that it's self-evident to Americans how that is.
Very good point.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.